So welcome to the Carilion Clinic Office of Continuing Professional Development, Office of Research Development, presenting our 2018 research series. So I'd like to remind people that in addition to this session, the same session will be repeated next Thursday at lunchtime. Hope we can get more people that can come that don't like waking up early. So Andrea is the best person to kick this off because she's going to talk about the research process. You'll see that these move from complexity of how to get started to like how you start managing your data, how do you navigate through what's conflict of interest, etc. So feel free to ask Andrea if any questions. This is supposed to be interactive. That includes the people on the phone. And so go ahead, Andrea.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. As Dr. Farrell said, I'm the Director of Clinical Trials, so in my role, I handle our budgets, contracts. I also manage our research coordinator staff. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to get started, navigate the Carilion research process, and get your project approved. So our objectives today, hopefully at the end of this, you will have a clear understanding of the research process at Carilion Clinic. You'll be aware of resources that are available to support your research endeavors, and you'll be aware of the different entities at Carilion that are responsible for research oversight. So we'll be talking about the approval process. There's 3 different approval processes that most projects will go through. This is going to be the R&D approval, IRB approval, and then conflict of interest. We'll talk about the startup process for grants, industry-funded trials, and non-funded studies, research oversight at Carilion, and then SOPs governing clinical research. So just to give you a little bit of background on our organization, we're an academic medical center. We have over 300 active research studies at this time. So as we continue to grow, our goal is to educate our current and future researchers to ensure that their research endeavors are successful. So as I mentioned, research projects will go through specific approvals before being able to initiate or enroll patients. We're looking at R&D, COI, and IRB. The IRB and R&D also require additional training to make sure that you understand all the aspects of particularly human subjects research and the regulations that govern those activities. So some of the required training, most of you have probably heard of CITY training. This is going to be various modules that train you to conduct human subjects research. There's the basic biomedical module and then good clinical practice module. So many of you may have taken these already. If you haven't, I would suggest taking both. They have great information, and that way if you are thinking about doing a project, you already have that required education. One thing to note is that GCP is required for any FDA regulated research. So then R&D also offers research training. We can do one-on-one training sessions. We can come give presentations to your groups. We also have educational modules. These have been available on Cornerstone in the past. They're in the process of being revamped to make sure all the information is current. So we're hoping to get those rolled out this spring. So the first thing you want to think about when you're doing a research project is to complete your R&D application. This recently was converted to an electronic process, so instead of a paper form, we now have a form built in REDCap that makes it much quicker and easier to complete the process. You can send it electronically to your leadership for approval. And this form really is for that purpose. So you want to make sure that within your department, you're getting the approval for your time and effort to work on a research project, that you are getting signatures from ancillary departments if you need their buy-in to also complete your project. I've included the link here. It's also on our Inside Carilion website under resources. One thing that the R&D application also does is it serves as a trigger point for R&D to send the application either to the research review committee or to schedule a feasibility meeting so that contracting, budgeting, and other items can be reviewed in that setting. So the CRRC, they review all non-funded studies. What they're looking at is data and statistical support, privacy and security, human resources and feasibility, and then whether or not a contract is needed. So even though a study is unfunded, it may still need a contract if we're sharing data or materials with outside organizations. The process with the CRRC, they will provide feedback to you and your research team within about 5 business days if any revisions are required. After that, if there's anything that needs to be updated, we'll work with the study team to ensure that it's been corrected or revised, and then R&D will grant approval. For industry-funded trials, those are reviewed by me as the Director of Clinical Trials. So that's usually when we're going to require a feasibility meeting, because clinical trials typically will involve other groups such as the pharmacy or the lab, and we want to make sure that they're prepared to support the study before we get started. With grant-funded studies, these are reviewed by our grants administrator, that's Matthew Sukup. He's going to be looking at the same types of things to make sure that we can participate in the study and that you have everything in order for your grant submission. So once the study's been deemed satisfactory, either by the CRRC, by the Director of Clinical Trials, or the grants administrator, R&D will provide your approval letter. And without your approval letter, you can't obtain IRB approval. So we have that relationship with the IRB to make sure that all aspects of the study are being reviewed prior to IRB approval and project initiation. So conflict of interest is another aspect that we look at, and this is for funded studies only. So Christina Cooper, who I believe is the next speaker in this series, she is our point of contact for research conflict of interest. There's a disclosure form that has to be filled out by all study team members prior to submitting to the IRB. So you can work with her to get those clearances in place. If there is a disclosure that's made, there may need to be a management plan. She'll walk you through that, and typically what that means is that a statement will be included in the consent form that says there is a financial relationship, and it has to be disclosed in that manner. So one thing we always recommend is to try to do this as early in the process as possible in case you do need to have a management plan, just to avoid delays and keep the project moving through. And again, the IRB will not approve a funded study without COI clearance.
So that's both federal and industry funded?
Yes. So the IRB is the last stage of approval. Following R&D and COI approval, the study team can submit to the IRB for the final step. So Carilion Clinic's IRB reviews all human subjects research. They also can look at projects that you believe fit the criteria for QA or QI, and can give you that designation so that you can move forward without being reviewed as human subjects research. So industry-funded clinical trials are reviewed by the Carilion Clinic IRB for personnel and local safety issues, but we actually rely on Western IRB as our IRB of record. Western IRB is a national IRB that reviews multi-site trials, so the benefit of that is if we're participating in a trial that a sponsor has initiated, they may have already reviewed the study on a national level, and we're just being looked at as an additional site. So it's a quicker process than going to a full board review with our Carilion IRB. So the IRB has recently launched an electronic review system called PRISM. The link is listed here. It's also, again, on the intranet and external page. Once you have submitted your project, the IRB will review the submission and provide feedback. The study may meet criteria for expedited review or exempt, and it can be reviewed without convening the full IRB review committee. If the study does meet criteria for full board review, it'll be brought before the IRB review committee for discussion with the investigator and the study team. If you would like additional information about the criteria that designates a study as exempt or expedited or requiring full board review, there is a list on the IRB's policy website that has detailed information. So when you're reviewing your project before submission, you can kind of get a feel for what type of review it will require. So once the review is completed and the application is determined to be acceptable by the IRB, they will grant you an approval letter. The most important thing I can tell you about IRB approval is any changes that you make to your study protocol during the course of the study, anything with personnel, study materials, or the consent form will require additional approval. So you can't make the determination on your own that you can change things to your project. You really do need to submit that through the IRB to make sure that they still approve what you're planning to do.
So you're saying the IRB submission is now all electronic?
Yes. Yes, so any follow-up submissions to, so your continuing review, any change forms, those all will go electronically through the PRISM system. Any other questions about that?
What's the turnaround time with that, with those revisions? Because I think that in some, new researchers, new folks doing that, it happens.
Sure. So I can speak for R&D. We try to get it back within 5 business days. I believe the IRB has about the same timeline. Yes.
We just went soup to nuts from the investigator submitting it to me for approval to go forward 3 weeks. That's like the fastest I've ever seen.
Yeah, that is really
That
good.
is really fast.
When you say pregnant, I'm going like, really?
Yeah, so
It's not a piece of paper that I have to find.
we really do emphasize trying to have a smooth, steady startup process because I know there's a lot of hurdles that our investigators have to work through. So we try to make it as easy on you all as possible. So what is the difference between IRB approval, R&D approval? Why are both necessary? So the IRB is really responsible for protecting the rights and welfare of human subjects, participants, where R&D is more responsible for the operational aspects of research. So we're looking at things like billing compliance, contracting, budgeting, feasibility analysis, and then personnel assignments. And just in a nutshell, the IRB will typically approve a study if it is safe and ethical. R&D will approve studies if they're feasible for the organization and have reasonable contract and budget terms. So which studies require a feasibility meeting? We really require that any study that's going to prospectively enroll patients and involve some type of intervention should have a feasibility meeting. So this is going to be anything with a drug, a device, or a specific research procedure. Looking at survey studies, observational studies, and retrospective studies, they don't really require feasibility meetings. They're typically low risk. There's not going to be any billing compliance issues. So we will usually be able to approve those without convening a feasibility meeting.
By construction is 0.25 miles. You are on the fastest route. You will arrive at 7:15.
I think somebody's GPS is talking.
And that's feasibility studies kicked
The
back.
conference is now in silent mode.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Sorry, the feasibility determination is kicked back to us?
Yes, so you would be contacted by me or by Matthew Sukup and say this meets all the criteria. Typically, it's decided within the feasibility meeting. I'll say our next steps are to go ahead and do contract and budget negotiations. If there are any pending issues that need further discussion, I'll communicate with the team to make sure we're getting everything we need before we move forward. So what we discuss at our feasibility meetings, I've mentioned we want to get approval from ancillary departments, so making sure pharmacy, lab, imaging, whoever needs to touch the protocol can support it in the way that we need them to. We look at coverage analysis, so if you're not familiar with this term, that means looking at which elements of the study are specific to research and which are considered standard of care or routine care. So will they happen outside of the participation in research? In that case, they can typically be billed to the patient or the patient's insurance, but if they're research specific, then we want to make sure that the study is covering the costs of those items. We're also going to look at budget development and review. So using the coverage analysis, you can develop your internal budget, meaning how much does it cost for Carilion to conduct this trial, and how much is the sponsor offering us to complete the trial. We'll also start looking at the terms of the contract, have legal review it. I manage that process for you, so typically I'll copy the investigators on those communications, but you don't have to be the one doing the contract negotiations. We're also looking at the logistical flow of the study schedule of events. So what's happening at which study visits, and does this make sense? Can we do this? An example of that is the patient might need to have a pre and post-dose EKG, but there's no EKG machine in the building where they want to see that patient. So that might be something we'd have to work through, getting a machine to that building, just things like that to make sure that it makes sense to do the study in the way that it's been presented to us. Additionally, we're going to look to make sure we have an appropriate patient population. So we might think that the study itself seems simple enough to do, but if we don't have the correct patient population, we're going to struggle with enrollment. Particularly in funded studies, we want to make sure that we're able to meet our enrollment numbers because we're contracted for those patients. Something that we have now to offer to our investigators is Trinetics. This is basically a de-identified database of our medical record system. And study teams, once they are granted an account with Trinetics, they can go in and query for feasibility volumes. So they can look to see with various diagnosis codes, do we have this patient population? And it has lots of natural language in it, so you might not even need to know the specific codes. You can just search terms that you're looking for your patients.
That's something that's available just to the feasibility committee, or is that available to researchers, the Trinetics?
It's available to researchers. You just have to put in a request with the health analytics team, and they can grant you an account.
Okay.
And so if you work with any of our research coordinators, they were all just recently granted access, and they're getting trained on this next month. So they'll all be pretty well versed in how to run these reports and get feasibility volumes as well.
And then in relationship to, just from a timing standpoint, let's say I'm applying for a federally funded grant, would the process be better R&D than application? Because it seems like this would be helpful when I'm making a budget and kind of getting my kind of ducks in a row for the grant submission. It seems like R&D should precede a grant submission.
Yes.
And then IRB subsequent to being approved for the grant.
That's typically how it would work. Some grants may require IRB approval prior to submission, but more often than not, that process would be the best way to go about it. The last thing that we look at when we're having feasibility meetings is just, are there any other glaring issues that would keep us from being successful? So this can run the gamut, but just any challenges that we feel would be insurmountable. So to get into more of the specifics of the startup process for industry-funded trials, usually the first step is going to be a non-disclosure or confidentiality agreement. This is negotiated and executed by the R&D office, and it is basically allowing the sponsor to share their protocol with us under the condition that we will keep their information confidential. So after a CDA has been negotiated and executed, the PI can review the protocol, and then we look at the feasibility of the protocol.
Just real quick.
Yeah.
So frequently you get kind of different companies reaching out and saying, hey, I'd like to share. In fact, I think I may have shared one with you yesterday.
Yes.
Where someone's contacting me saying, hey, I'd like an NDA, we'd like to have a further discussion. Should that, before I make any further steps, the process would be send it to you?
Yes.
And let you negotiate that NDA before we make any kind of further
Yes,
steps?
and I can usually get an NDA executed within a week, so it's a quick process. If we've worked with the company before, it's even faster because I just mimic the terms we've agreed to before. So we're also looking at doing master CDAs with companies that we work with frequently so that we don't have to do them over and over. So once feasibility has been confirmed, Carilion, which would be known as the institution or site, begins the budget and contract negotiations. Again, that's handled centrally by the R&D office. So when we're looking at our contracts, we want to make sure that they're protecting us and our patients' best interests while also working quickly with the sponsor to execute the agreement. So we try to strike that balance in our negotiations. The calculated internal costs, meaning how much it costs for Carilion to do a study, are compared to the sponsor's budget, which is the external budget. If the budget is comprehensive enough to cover our costs, it will be accepted, but this is rare. So normally we do a few rounds of negotiations in order to get the budget where we need it to be. If the budget does not cover internal costs, as I mentioned, negotiations will begin. And then all study budgets have a 30% overhead rate applied to the direct costs. And then with federally funded projects, it's a 60% overhead rate.
How does that fall in the industry standard?
It's pretty comparable. We don't really get much pushback. It seems to be the standard across many sites to do about 30.
For federal trials.
I think that is also comparable. I know I wasn't involved in this process, but I know we had consultants come in and do some market research to make sure that we were in line with other organizations.
So they come and actually tell you what your rate's going to be, and then that's on the 60%.
Hey, it's an externally funded.
Meaning the federal government, okay?
So just to be clear, that's to support our own internal staff and work?
Yes.
What that money's used for, okay.
So overhead goes back. There's a portion of it that goes back to Carilion just for general expenses. There's a portion of it that goes to the PI of the project, and then the remaining...
Can you review what those percentages are?
Sure. So of the 30% that we're collecting, 60% of that just goes to Carilion for general operating expenses. The remaining 40% is split. 20% goes to the PI, 20% goes to the PI's department. And those funds can be used for a number of activities. So you can use it for travel, education, additional research, staffing for research. So it's nice that there's a little bit of money set aside to support additional educational and research endeavors through our overhead.
You might say it doesn't go away too it's kind of best.
Right, so that account, once it's set up for you or your department, it rolls over year to year. So there's no, fiscal year's about to end, hurry up and spend your overhead. So you can really build up a significant amount of funding through that avenue.
There is regulation, or, we have policies around, CME and how you can use it, things like that. Is there a similar policy?
Yes.
That your group manages?
Yes, and that's on the Page Center X with all of our policies. And that really gets into all the details of what's approved and what's not approved for overhead.
And that submission for using those monies goes through?
Our office, yes. Michelle Rothrock specifically. So if you need to spend down some of your overhead, you'll just email or call her and she can manage that for you. And also if you need updates on your balances, she can give you your latest balance. So Carilion requires that for industry-funded projects, you must wait until the contract has been executed to submit to the IRB. Some institutions may not require that, but the reason we do is really for financial risk management. So there is a fee that's incurred when we submit to the IRB. So we want to make sure all the terms of the contract are final before we go ahead through that process. And then, as I mentioned, we work through Western IRB for multi-center industry-funded studies. So once you have IRB approval, really the last step is your site initiation visit. This is when the sponsor of the study comes on site and holds a comprehensive training for all of the study team members. Once this has been completed, the site may begin enrolling patients to the trial. So that's going to be your basically kickoff date for when you can begin enrolling patients. So I've included just some samples of the schedule of events, and then we'll get to the budget after this. But this is just a very pared down version of what we see when we look at our protocols, of the grid of what's happening at which particular visits. And it's usually very detailed. Everything that's required for the study should be included in the schedule of events. This is hard to see, and I apologize, but this is a sample of one of our internal study budgets. So if you can see this, it's grouped by coordinator time, if you're using a study coordinator, physician time, office visits, lab, pharmacy, radiology, whatever other groups are involved in the study would have a separate section for their costs. They're outlined by each visit and what's happening, so it's very similar to the schedule of events. We've just assigned costs to the elements of the study. And then we subtotal that for each visit, apply the 30% overhead, and then you get your per patient cost. So we'd multiply that by how many patients we think we're going to enroll, and that's going to give us our total study budget. Any questions about that so far? So this is part of our study budget as well. This is not the per patient cost, but these are kind of our fixed costs or our invoiceable costs. So we always have a startup fee for funded studies. This is when we're basically compiling all the work that we've done in order to get this study off the ground, and we get reimbursed for those activities. There's also a fee for pharmacy startup, pharmacy maintenance, any procedures that don't happen on a set schedule, so it may be as needed. You do a chest x-ray, you would make this an invoiceable item. So anytime it occurs, you'd submit an invoice to the sponsor.
Is this in your budget, or is this above and beyond your budget?
This is within the budget.
But it's budgeted for that?
Yes, yes. Other things that we're going to be reimbursed for: screen failures. So if you are looking at a patient, they go through a series of tests, but they don't meet the criteria to be randomized, we still need to be reimbursed for the work that we've done to evaluate that patient. Monitoring visits. So anytime a monitor comes on site and reviews our work, we have to dedicate staff time in order to do that, and so we request reimbursement for that as well. Protocol amendments, SAE reporting, just all the things that can't be built into that per patient cost that still involves work on our part that we have to be reimbursed for.
Do you take the PI's time into consideration? I must say my monitor visits have been a not insignificant amount of time.
Yes. So that is not factored into this invoiceable fee, but if you go back, there is a line item for PI oversight for every visit. So we build that into the whole study. But if you find that it's becoming burdensome, we can add in physician time for our monitoring visits as well. And these are all flexible. So if there's anything that comes up that you think of that you would like to be compensated for or have Carilion be compensated for, we can make adjustments.
I guess my only question is sometimes you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And so if your process becomes different, I'm assuming once the budget has been executed, you're done.
So you can actually request an amendment to the budget. We've been successful with that, where we've started studies and said, you know what, we didn't quite realize how time-consuming this one particular aspect would be, and we can ask for more money.
So Sean, on that note, when the Henry started, we were actually in the red doing clinical trial work with sponsors, and since Andrew's come on board, I think she's gotten so good at negotiating budgets, we generally break even, or we're within. This last year was $90,000 was the differential for about $1 million worth of work.
So this is something we're looking at very closely, and it can adapt over time. So any suggestions are welcome, or if you just want to talk about any concerns that you might have. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the grant startup process. This is mostly an overview. If you have any specific questions, please contact Matthew Sukup to walk through the details of the grant startup process. So again, you're going to want to contact R&D as soon as possible if you plan on submitting an extramural application. The grant administrator will work with the study team to prepare a budget, gather documentation such as bio sketches or institutional forms, and determine the requirements for submission. If you're working with external collaborators, you would need a letter of commitment from their institution to support their participation in the grant. We're also requiring the eCraft or the R&D application, that's our electronic version of it, must be completed and approved by the department chair prior to submitting the application package.
Would this then also include, let's say there's, like, we have a Pediatric Surgical Association grant that's like small, $20,000, $50,000 type. Would that be included in doing R&D before such a process, or?
I think so. So Matthew really does manage all of the grants within the system. Francis, do you have anything to add to that?
The main thing we're looking for, Dr. Stafford, is your department chair has to approve your time to pursue that grant.
Okay.
Yes.
There are some grants that kind of require sort of I guess a separate area where you know that grant money, is going to be applied to whatever you said in your grant or budget. And do we go through Matthew for that too? Is it, I'm still new here, I just don't know how.
Yes, because he works with accounting to do the post-award management.
Okay.
So tracking the expenses of the grant, even if it's not research related, he can still assist with that. Yes, it's Matthew, Matthew, and then Soukup, Soukup.
Can you just go back one slide?
Sure.
I'll make a comment. The effort that your chair is going to approve is we're trying to line it up with that quarterly attestation that we're now doing, so that if they're starting to go over, then we can change the number. That's what we're trying to do. Trying to keep the track of, so that we're all saying the same thing. We're not aligned right now.
Yes.
The approval from the chair, is that also electronic?
Yes.
So you just fill it out, and you fill out the eCraft.
And then it gets forwarded to your chair, and they do an electronic signature as well.
So we forward it, right? So
We will.
Oh, you forward it. So okay, so you just put like.
You submit it. The system will send it to the chair.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And that's what I'm saying, it's so quick.
It's usually 24 hours.
Yeah.
Really?
The reason that this one took 3 weeks is because she was away for a week on vacation.
Right. Yeah, so it's a...
And then where do we submit it? Is there a website? Or how do I get?
Yes, so the link, I think my slides will be shared after this. The link is within these slides. It's also on our Inside Carilion page for research and development. It's under resources, and it's the electronic R&D application. The IRB electronic application is also linked there as well.
I'll take responsibility. I kind of didn't want to muddy the waters because we had this new IRB system that we're rolling out. We wanted to go with one application, but we got pushback from the department chairs that they actually saw a lot of value in this eCraft application to make sure they know what their folks are doing and keeping track of time and effort, which is not in your IRB application.
Can I ask you, does this also apply for just QA and QI work as well? We do the same application?
So, I think for the QA/QI, your first step is to do that determination form with the IRB to make sure it truly is a QA/QI project. If it is, you can go straight through. If it's not, then you'd backtrack and submit it as research.
So that's on the website too? You just do, and that's electronic as well? So you do
Yes.
that form first, and then somebody will get back to you and say,
Right.
this qualifies, and then you do the R&D?
If it's research. If it's not research, we don't need
Really?
an application. Yeah. But there is usually kind of a fine line, so it's good to go through the process to make sure it truly does meet the QA/QI criteria.
So just to be clear, if you're thinking this is, notice the word thinking.
Yes.
It doesn't mean it is. But if you're thinking it's QA/QI, you start with the IRB to get permission and to allocate it as a QA/QI. Because then, if it is, there's no R&D.
Correct.
Okay, and there's no further IRB.
And
Correct.
there's
Just-
no approval
just
of chair
go.
or anything,
So
right? So you could
that I'm not sure about. I think if you're still assigning time to it, you should probably at least discuss it with the
Oh,
chair.
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
There's no formal
Not through us, no.
approval of where she'd have to sign.
Correct.
There's an approval so that not every person in the department decides, I want to do this, and you're taxing our people, our data managers to pull data that you're not doing. So that's why I want to keep track of who's doing what. Is this real? Okay. Please go for it.
All right. Okay, so just to hit on this again, anything that involves the prospective patient enrollment with a research intervention, even if it is a grant, that also is going to require the feasibility meeting. And as I mentioned earlier, depending on the grant type, IRB approval may be required prior to submission of the award. That's just going to depend on the terms of the grant. If the grant is awarded, the agreement will be negotiated and the study will be submitted to the IRB if it has not been done in pre-award. And again, R&D handles the contracting process for you.
Do you ever get into a situation where the grant's awarded, but you don't get IRB approval?
I have not experienced that, but I could see where maybe that would be an issue, and that's why we've tried to implement this process now where we do the feasibility review before we move forward in the process, just to see if there are any red flags that we can identify.
But your feasibility review is not, it's really looking at the operations part, right? It's the R&D look at this.
That's true. We're not
I've
reviewing.
never had this happen, but
Yeah.
that's our process. Usually we get IRB approval before.
That brings up the point about scientific merit, and that's a discussion we need to have with the department chairs if we wanted to have that type of process. Right now, we don't.
So you're not looking at scientific merit of the study?
No.
If that's what we're supposed to look at, I'll grant you that it's hard. It's not always easy to be able to tell the merit. I guess we need more fine-tuning on that.
Okay, so just to go over some of the timelines for submission deadlines if you're working on a grant, we ask that you submit the budget and budget justification no later than 10 business days prior to the deadline. So that allows our grant administrator to review the budget, ask any questions, fill in any gaps as needed. All collaborative or subaward materials are needed 5 business days prior to the submission deadline. And then with at least 3 business days of lead time prior to the deadline, R&D will perform a complete proposal review and then submit within 1 business day of the deadline. So then switching over to the last group, this is our non-funded study startup process. Again, you'd still complete the electronic R&D application. If there's any feedback, we'll provide that within 5 business days. And then our sponsor project administrator, which is Michelle Rothrock, she does our contract negotiations for non-funded studies with external collaborators.
Just for new people, Virginia Tech is an external collaborator presently. That might change in
VTCRI too, right?
That's correct, yeah.
But we do have master agreements in place, so it's a quicker process. So depending on the external collaborator's institution, IRB approval may be required prior to contract negotiation. I know Virginia Tech is one of those institutions who requests that. And then you would proceed directly to the IRB submission following the R&D approval letter. We will handle contract negotiations in the background as you're going through the IRB process. And then the CRRC is reviewing for privacy and security, data analytics, and human resource allocation. So just a note on contracts in general. Carilion does not permit investigators to sign contracts on behalf of the organization. All of our contracts need to be reviewed centrally by the R&D office, and we have institutional signatories. That's Dr. Harrington and Dr. Watley. This is for research contracts. So for other contracts, there's a separate stream of where those need to go. But a lot of times we'll have investigators sign a CDA thinking, oh, it's just a CDA. I'm not really promising that much, but it really should come through centrally for review. So just some resources that we offer to support your research. We have central clinical research coordinator support. So Within our office, there are 3 research coordinators who are basically float coordinators. So as I get requests from departments who don't have a designated research coordinator, I can assign one of our central staff to support those projects. That is assigned on a first come, first served basis, so there may be times where you request coordinator support and we can't offer it if we already have everyone fully assigned. And then
And you're saying that that's just for, like, I need someone to help collect data or collect, kind of coordinate the day of like a patient visit. Is that what you mean?
full study management, really. So we have, as I mentioned, we have 3. They each support about 5 to 7 clinical trials at any given time.
They're going to do all the regulatory stuff.
Yes. They do all the regulatory, they'll manage data collection, patient visit management, any of the documentation that's required, so.
What is about the new position we're trying to create? Research assistant.
Yes, so we historically had a position called a clinical research assistant. Over time, it got phased out for various reasons, but we're trying to reinstate that because we found there really are a lot of projects that don't require the full support of a clinical research coordinator being able to manage a drug or device study. It may be a survey study or a retrospective study that a more entry-level position could manage. So we're looking to add those positions now so that we can offer that as a resource as well.
How do you fund those? Is that,
That's 60% overhead.
no, but okay. No, but that,
So we were thinking that most of those would be externally funded, so to use the word that you hear in academia, these would be soft money positions. You get a grant.
and that helps pay for that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the many non-funded studies that we have that are into research projects for residents and stuff like that.
So some departments have used their overhead funds. We haven't officially hired anyone yet, but we've had discussions about setting aside overhead money.
One of our discussions that we want to have.
These will generally be gap year students that want to go to medical school, that want to get a year of research under the belt. I think it's going to be a great program that we're going to have. It's great.
We also offer central budgeting for grants and trials, central regulatory management for industry-funded trials. So we actually have a position within our department called a regulatory affairs specialist. She manages IRB submissions, pulling together 1572s, all of the regulatory documentation that's needed to maintain a study. And
If you don't have your own.
so she actually does this for the department coordinators as well. It's a central resource for everyone who has a funded trial. For now, yeah. In conjunction with the coordinators, she's basically overseeing the process, and they're assisting with compiling. So it's currently Sarah Henderson. She is actually leaving our department at the end of the month, but we plan to replace it immediately.
Is she really? Wow.
Yeah.
Collaborator, so you.
She lives in Radford, so.
Yes, but that will be replaced. We won't let that position go away. Again, we have central post-award management for grants and industry-funded trials, central contracting. We can assist with project development and protocol development, and then feasibility
When you
review.
say we, who do you, what's the central without having to like contact Dr. Farrell, you said, kind of, what's the process? You know, that-
So we are a little bit slim in our office, so you can contact us directly. So myself, Dr. Farrell, Matt Suka, Michelle Rothrock.
Let's say I don't know which of those people I need to contact. Is there like a central?
Central research.
Sure.
Because again, I feel bad contacting you saying, what do I do with this?
Or just go to research and clinic. Or one thing that we should probably mention, I think the reason why our organization, I think, works very nimble, is we retain 2 external lawyers that specialize in clinical research, and they're actually paid through the clinical legal department. And so we get very rapid turnover. And it's a small boutique law firm that specializes in clinical research. They're very knowledgeable. So that's really where it helps us move these things along. It's not just us making judgments calls.
But if you do have a general inquiry, research at carillionclinic.org, and we'll route it internally. Sure. So Research oversight at Carilion is managed by R&D, the compliance department, and the IRB. Each of these departments can conduct quality reviews and/or study audits to ensure that researchers are following organizational policies, SOPs, and federal regulations. Usually, these will be done more as educational exercises rather than for cause, but there are instances where if there's suspicion of research misconduct or something along those lines, they will come, either compliance or the IRB or our office will come in and review the project. When in doubt, just reach out to any of us to ask for guidance. I think it's always better to ask questions than to make assumptions in research, so we're available for any questions that you may have. Just to touch on clinical research SOPs, standard operating procedures provide specific guidance to our investigators who are conducting clinical research at Carilion. They increase our compliance, reduce errors, and allow new investigators to learn the proper way to conduct clinical research at our organization. We base these procedures on federal regulations, guidance from the FDA, and local best practices, and they can all be found at our internal website, again, inside Carilion, under the Research and Development page, if you'd like to look through those. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming, and if you think of anything afterwards, just feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you.